Welcome to Lecture 6, which is on hurricane history. This is going to be a much more laid back lecture after we went through lectures 1 through 5 and really focused in depth on a lot of hurricane forecasting, hurricane tips. And I try to make you guys as versatile as possible, giving you as much variety as possible. Obviously, forecasting is an art, and it's up to you to choose the tips that works best for you. Not all of them are going to work the way you want, and nothing works perfectly in weather anyway. But with time, hopefully, you'll pick the ones you really like. I use most of them. I don't use all of them all the time, but I do use most of them. And most of the time, they are very helpful. I mean, obviously, nothing's perfect when it comes to forecasting, but the more advantages I can have at my disposal, the more comfortable and more confident I'm going to feel in my forecast. And, I'm a weather historian. I love it all. I love hurricanes and tornadoes and, big nor'easters. But today we're going to focus on hurricane history. I've talked a little bit about this in my introduction post and maybe a little bit in some of the lectures as well. But we're going to focus on this a little bit more in depth. Again, very laid back. This is not going to be, overly complex in any ways. I'm just going to talk about some of the history. And obviously you could do an entire class on this, so I'm just kind of touching on some of the, more famous storms. And also, I'm going to put a lot of books and stuff in there that you can read. So if you are a big fan of weather history like me, you can buy the books and read them and just continue to learn more. Because the more you know about the history, the better you are going to be with future storms and just forecasting in general. I mean, when you have this database in your mind, when you know what these storms have done in the past, it kind of helps prepare you for the storms of the future. And it lets you know if this is really an unusual storm or if this storm really can't compare to storms in the past. All right, so we'll go through this. We're going to have a fun time with this, and we're going to keep it pretty laid back. So here's Wilbur Jones. In this picture, he was 101 years old. I talked about him a little bit in my introduction post. One of the most amazing people I've ever met in my entire life. Again, 101 years old in this picture, and he was getting around great. Unfortunately, he did pass away at about 103, 104, but still an amazing life. He did all sorts of things, and it's not just hurricane related. I mean, he was a great man. He was a golf pro that was good friends with Arnold Palmer, and he was, really good at golf. Before that, in World War II, he flew bombers, over, England and all through Europe. I can't even imagine what that was like. And then I went and interviewed him. He lived in Tallahassee at the time. I went down there, and I interviewed him about the 35 Labor Day, but that's when I learned about the rest of his life, and also that he was in the 26 Great Miami Hurricane as well. All right, so again, it was an incredible honor to interview him, and I do have tons and tons of video that I'm going to go through and I kind of break it down and hopefully one day either share it in a book form or some other media form. So here's the famous train, right? Here's the 1935 Labor Day train. And right here, this little boxcar here is where Wilbur Jones was. Okay, so I could talk about this storm for probably an hour straight, but I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. To make a long story short, Wilbur was in his, I think he was like 22, 23. I can't remember exactly how old he was, but lower 20s. He worked for the FEC, the Florida East Coast Railroad. And at the time, he was an accountant for them. And he would go down the Keys fairly often and do, work for the railroad. And unfortunately for him, or, I don't know how you want to look at it. I mean, as much as I love hurricane chasing, this is not one you really want to be on, especially in 1935 in an island with 892 millibar pressure and 200-mile-an-hour winds. As much as I love to chase hurricanes, that's not one you want to mess with. And he was down there with a lot of other workers, and they had an idea that there was going to be some storminess, but no one understood the force of the hurricane that was going to come. A lot of the forecasting, keep in mind, this is 1935, were not correct. It's keeping the storm well to their south, which actually was not accurate at all. And there was a lot of other things that played into this. But from his standpoint, the storm is coming. It's becoming apparent that something bad's going to happen. Keep in mind, the people that live in the Keys were actually some of the best meteorologists of their time. They always looked at their barometer. And they didn't really care what anyone else told them when it came to forecasts. If they saw that barometer drop, they knew something bad was coming. Well, even though they knew something bad was coming, no one could really fathom what really was coming. And again, to make this incredible long story kind of short, He was in the Hotel Matacumbe that day, and I'll show you a picture of that. And it kind of relates to another survivor that I ran into. And he knew things were getting bad, so they were sending a train down to get the World War One veterans. All right, and why were the World War One veterans down there? Well, that's a huge story in its own. But obviously, this was during the Great Depression, and they were promised a bonus from World War One, but they had to wait a certain amount of time to get it. Well, they were striking in D.C. and they wanted their bonus right away because obviously with the Great Depression, money was scarce. Well, FDR worked out an arrangement to send them down the Keys to work on the Florida road. They were going to make a road eventually. It's going to take a while, but from Key West all the way to the mainland, right? So they were working on this road. Well, these World War One veterans were not exactly in the nicest conditions. These camps weren't that great. Yes, I think they were making, $1 a day. They were making okay money, especially for the Great Depression. But the conditions weren't well. There was a lot of drinking going on. And even that weekend, they got paid. And a lot of these veterans were actually drunk when this hurricane was coming. Thankfully, a lot of them did leave to Key West. But it's a crazy story on its own. But anyway, these World War One veterans are in these camps. This train's coming down to get them. Well, unfortunately, they didn't really understand hurricanes the way they needed to, all right? When someone said, hey, a hurricane's going to make landfall at 8 p.m., back then they thought, oh, well, it's fine until 8 p.m. They didn't understand that the conditions really started to deteriorate way before 8 p.m. So they send the train from Miami. And I think when it got to Homestead, it had to wait on the bridge. And then as it was coming down through the Keys, it got stuck on some cable in Windley Key. And then eventually did get to Almirada. The problem was they sent the train at 4 p.m. And this conductor who's backing the train down the Keys into a Category 5 gets to Almirada right around 8 p.m. as the worst of the hurricane is getting close. First off, the guy backing the train down in Cat 5, I don't know why he didn't stop and turn around, but obviously he knew he was trying to save people and get these veterans. Well, unfortunately for the veterans, the train didn't make it to the camp. It made it to the Almirada train station, and that's where Wilbur comes in. He moved to the train station. As you can see from the picture here, this is where the train station was, gone. Over here is what's left of the post office. Down here, what's crazy, I can take you down the Keys and show you exactly where this road is. These are Australian pines that are completely stripped. And this house obviously was rebuilt and everything, but this still exists today. And it's crazy because I can show you exactly where the hurricane laid on the road here. Things were getting bad. This building's starting to fall apart. So there was a sidetrack, and you had two cars on the sidetrack, and the train hadn't got there yet. So Wilbur and some other men, they went into the sidecar, all right? The train shows up, and the other people get on the train. There was already people already on the train. And as it gets there, the worst is starting to come in. And the surge comes and overtops the train. And when it does that, their sidecar kind of tips over. And now the water's filling up in the sidecar. And he said it got to about 2 feet from the top. And they were able to chop their way out of it. And, thankfully the surge stopped, and then it came back down. They almost drowned in there, but they got out. They got back into the train. And they rode out the rest of the storm in that train. This storm was just incredible, obviously. 892 millibars, 200-mile-an-hour winds. If it wasn't for this train, there is no way any of these people would have survived. And if a few people did, it would have been just by luck, really, okay? So that was really his story. And what's crazy, too, is even this came in on Labor Day, on a Monday. On the Tuesday, it was still really stormy as well. It wasn't until that Wednesday that they started getting some people in there to help and get people out of there, okay? So here's another picture of the train just pushed over. You can see how the surge came from the south there and just pushed this over. Here's the locomotive that was still on the track. All the cars were off the track. There's all these people on the track. When you look close, all the windows are blown out. But this is what saved these people. The World War I veterans in the camp, most of them perished because they didn't have this protection. While, yes, it tipped over, it did save them. All right, so pretty crazy story. I could talk a lot longer on it, but, I don't want to make this lecture 2 hours long. Here's the Hotel Matacumbe. This is where he started off. And this bus right here kind of ties into the next survivor. Her name is Alma Pinder. And they weren't too far away. they were probably, I'd say, a half mile from this hotel here, and they ended up there after the storm. They went into this bus there. Her mother got severely injured in it. So this is Alma Pinder. She was 11 years old at the time of the storm, and this is Everett Albury, and he was 6 years old at the time. Where she was, which is close to the Hotel Matacumbe and lower Almirada, all right. The Hotel Matacumbe there, the pressure was about 899 millibars, all right. So the worst of it was still a little bit south of them, but obviously they're having the onshore flow there, even though on a key you can get it both sides, but still they're in a bad spot, all right. And then where Everett was, he was up in Tavernier, which is about, I don't know, 12 or so miles as the crow flies away. It was 972 millibars, all right? So 73 millibar gradient between where Alma was and Everett was in only 12 miles. I mean, that's just incredible. Her story is amazing. They were in a home and it just completely blew to pieces. She's floating on debris. Her uncle saves her life getting her on top of the debris pile. And unfortunately, her uncle did pass away. 4 of her family members died. Her mother was severely injured and ended up in that bus. What's crazy is on that Wednesday when they were getting her out of the Keys, Wilbur, who was still at the train, remembers Alma's mom being carried out. He actually remembers that. So it's crazy how those two survivors passed across. And then where Everett was, even though it wasn't as bad, it was much further away from the core, and this was a small, intense hurricane, his house dislodged and floated, literally floated up to the railroad track. So an incredible storm. There's so many stories with it. The strongest hurricane in recorded history, 892 millibars on land. Okay, we're not talking about open water. We're talking on land, all right? And here's the memorial. If you go down the Keys, you can see that. A lot of people that passed away, unfortunately, their ashes are in this kind of crypt below this here. So pretty incredible storm. Strongest hurricane in recorded U.S. history. So a couple books if you want to read more about it. Willie Dyer, good friend of mine. I've really done a lot of research with him, and he's a really cool guy. He actually did a second edition of Storm of the Century. You can find the first one, which is great. The second one's a little more updated and more detailed, so if you're looking for an awesome book, this is the one to get. This is the one I highly recommend. Also, Category 5 by Knowles is also very good. This is a little bit more of a storytelling, where this one's a little bit more of factual, more detailed meteorology. When I say that, I mean more like, this is what happened, like step by step by step. This one has a little bit more of a story in the background and, the World War I veterans and things like that, okay? Last Train to Paradise, this kind of all ties in because that day that train went down to the Keys. That was it. That was the last time that train ever ran. It used to go from Miami to Key West. I can't even imagine how cool that must have been to be on that train. But that was the last day that train ran, and this is a cool book on that and just the history of the Florida East Coast Railroad by a guy named Henry Flagler, who, for his time, did some pretty incredible things. And then if you like stuff, just a little bit more detail of the history of hurricanes, this is a good book on that by Jane Barnes. Again, not really storytelling. It's just, hey, this storm did this storm did that. Here was the pressure, here was the winds, but still pretty cool if you're into the meteorology side of stuff. So this kind of ties into the 26 hurricane. Now, I told you Wilbur was in this as well. His family at the time was living in Coral Gables, and Coral Gables is just south of Miami, and that's where this hurricane went in. Now, while this hurricane wasn't as intense as the 35 hurricane, it hit a very populated area, obviously, and even in 26, Miami was starting to really flourish, all right? Nothing like today, obviously, but for its time, it was flourishing. And it was a big hurricane, all right? 35 Labor Day, small. This one was a large hurricane, and here's Miami Beach, just devastated. If you had a hurricane like this today, go through Miami Beach, Coral Gables, South Miami, it would just be apocalyptic almost. I mean, it would just be just so bad. At least probably $500 billion in damage. All right, it would be really, really bad. And Miami's been lucky. I talked about that in the other lecture with mesovortices. Miami's been lucky. So got down to 27.61 in Miami, which is 935 millibars. Pretty low. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. That's a very strong It was a Category 4 at landfall, 145, 150. And this kind of relates back to Andrew. Now, Andrew was a much smaller storm. The 26 storm was much larger. But this is really the last big one that's come close to Miami as far as, very powerful storm. Wilma came through the backside there, but nothing compared to, Andrew 26. But what I always try to tell people is Andrew didn't hit Miami. Andrew's a very compact storm, and it hit Homestead. All right, so Miami's been very lucky. As I've talked about in the past, they've gone through some stretches where they've been hit a lot. They got hit by some powerful hurricanes in 45, 47, 48, 49, 1950. They got hit by Hurricane King. So Miami's gone through some stretches where they've been hit a lot, and they haven't in recent times, and that's something that really concerns me. All right, if you take the 26 hurricane and you equal it to what it would be in 2018 dollars, you see the cost. I mean, it's almost double even the 1900 Galveston hurricane, which we'll talk about, which changed American history, and Katrina. All right, so imagine one today of the same intensity hitting Miami with how big that city's become. It would be devastating. All right, so fingers crossed. I hope they stay lucky, but Miami's luck is probably going to run out here soon. So here's a great book on this. This is The Florida Hurricane and Disaster by Reardon. This is the original first edition. It's pretty expensive if you find this. Probably costs you at least $100. But you can find the more recent one. That's the same book. They just put it in a different binding and more. I think it was redone in 1986. So this is a great book if you want to read more about the 26 hurricane. That's Bayshore Drive. If you've been to Miami, that is Bayshore Drive, and that's not even the worst of it. That's probably as it's receding. I mean, the water's probably still a good 10 feet deep at this point. All right. Next one we're going to talk about is the Lake Okeechobee storm. I showed you this. This is one of those classic Cape Verde storms that made it across the entire Atlantic. This is that 10% that did make it, even though it formed east to 35. And what I've told you in the past is the ones that do make it, those 10% are usually pretty bad. This was a very bad hurricane. It came in near West Palm Beach as a Category 4, another large, powerful hurricane. It came across Lake Okeechobee. At first, the southerly flow the northerly flow, I should say, caused the levees and dikes here to break, and you had massive flooding as much as 20 feet deep, and it killed a whole bunch, thousands of people, all right? And then as the hurricane moved out, now the southerly flow caused flooding on the northern side. Not quite as bad, but still really bad. So this Belglade and some of these places here were just annihilated. There was just nothing left. And officially, it's around 3,000 to 4,000 people that passed away. But unfortunately, back then, with the way things were back then, a lot of the migrant and minority workers that lived there and worked there weren't even counted as dead, which is just mind-boggling to me. But that is true. Unfortunately, that stuff happened, and I think that the death toll is much higher, probably at least 5,000, if not higher. So here's a good book on that, The Black Cloud. It's a pretty darn good book on the 28 hurricane, Lake Okeechobee storm. Another one, Killer Kane. It's another pretty good book. So if you're interested in getting some books on that storm, that's really historic, famous storm, and shows you this is very vulnerable, even to this day. Lake Okeechobee is vulnerable. A lot of the infrastructure here is becoming very old and obsolete. If you had a hurricane like this again, this could easily happen. Now, hopefully it wouldn't be thousands dead because people would leave, but still, this is a bad situation in the making, and it's happened before, right? So, hey, it's happened before. It probably might happen again, especially if you don't take it seriously, you don't put the proper precautions in place. All right, so now we got the 38 Long Island Express. We talked about this with how fast and powerful the storm was. It came right through Long Island and Connecticut, absolutely devastating. I think it was 942 millibars when it went over Long Island. Category 3, incredible storm surge. Providence was under about 15 feet of water. Many other places saw similar storm surge. Really fast winds. I told you about the Blue Hill Observatory in Massachusetts. Yes, there's elevation to it. Can't remember exactly how high it is. I don't know, about 400 or 500 feet, somewhere around there. They had 86 mile an hour wind gusts, and I believe the sustained winds were 121 miles an hour. So again, For New England, incredible. All right, maybe you can't compare it to the 35 or the 26 or the 28, but it's relative to your area. I mean, Mississippi doesn't get a lot of snow. If you had a foot of snow in Minneapolis, people can handle it. If you had a foot of snow in Jackson, Mississippi, it would be devastating. All right, so for this area, an incredible storm, and they do get hit. I've talked about this. They have been very blessed, very lucky. And again, like Miami, unfortunately, their luck will eventually run out. Here's the track. Obviously, it was flying up the coast, 942 millibars of landfall. I mean, that's pretty darn low. Very powerful storm. While Sandy obviously was bad, and I'm not taking anything away from it, it can't even compare to the storm as far as wind strength and overall strength of the storm, okay? Sandy was bad, not saying it wasn't, but this, if you had a storm like this today, it would be like the 26 Miami hurricane, but in Miami type thing, right? Remember I talked about how, $500 billion in damage in Miami? Well, it might even be worse here. And they're not as prepared, and, with the storm moving so fast, it could lead to a lot of deaths as well. Sudden Sea is a good book on the 38 hurricane. That's a good one. The Great Hurricane of 38 is also another good one as well. Their history goes way back to when we first came over here, all right? So you had a hurricane that affected the Revolutionary War, so that's a cool book if you want to talk, or if you want to look into that. They had one in 1775. They had another one in 1780. And the one in 1780, that one killed like 20,000 people in the Caribbean. And even though it didn't really affect the United States, it destroyed a lot of the British and French fleet, which kind of affected this whole war as well. Here's the great 1635 colonial hurricane. It is hypothesized that this was even stronger than the 38 hurricane, 1938. This is probably stronger. I mean, it's 4 millibars less now. Pressure doesn't always relate to wind and strength exactly, but still a very powerful storm that was moving fast up the coast, hitting a similar area, and this was devastating. If something like that happened today, it would be absolutely devastating. Here's some other hurricanes. You had the one in 1638, you had 1635, you had 1815. It's not even including 1821 that came this way. You had 1938. You had the 1954 season with Edna and Carol. Again, I know they haven't been hit in a long time, but you can see it has happened in the past. So when it happens again and people say this has never happened, that's not true. It has happened. All right, Hurricane Camille. One of the benchmark storms. Living in Mississippi, you hear a lot of stories about this. It's an incredible storm, very powerful storm, Category 5 at landfall. One of only 4. You have the 35 Labor Day, you have Camille, you have Andrew, and then now you have Hurricane Michael. All right, so Camille, very compact storm. And unfortunately with Camille, it really kind of directly related to Katrina as well. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first with Camille, if you want to read more about some of the stories with Camille and this powerful, amazing storm, The Roar of the Heavens is fantastic. That's a good book. I haven't read this one, but I heard it's good. Category 5, The Story of Camille. Several people told me it was good, so I added that one as well. So when you compare Camille to Katrina, obviously, Camille had faster 1-minute sustained surface winds, but it was a more compact, smaller storm, and it was coming at a little bit different angle. So if you're in Bay St. Louis and Pastor Cheyenne, I mean, it was obliterated, obviously, and even all the way in the Gulfport and Biloxi was heavily damaged. Katrina, the wind speeds were not as strong, but you can see how much larger. You see those faster winds over a larger area, right? So it affected a much larger area. And what was tricky was when I was down along the Mississippi coast, again, I was only 25 at the time, and I'm sure a lot of people, are, you're young, and we appreciate the warnings, but we're going to be fine. I can't tell you how many people I talked to that were like, son, I survived Camille, and if I survived Camille, I can survive anything. And it was in people's mind that was the benchmark storm. There can't be anything worse. Well, yes, the wind speeds were exceptional, but if you were in Gulfport or Biloxi, it wasn't the same as Katrina when it came to the storm surge. Camille's storm surge was very, very bad. It was about 24, 25 feet in Pastor Cheyenne. But Katrina was more like 30 and it was over a larger area. So fortunately, a lot of people that passed away were people that survived in Camille, stayed in an area they probably really shouldn't have stayed in. And while Katrina wasn't as strong, it was larger with more of a kinetic energy behind it. We've talked about that. Um, we talked about the power being distributed over a larger area. And these people were in the path of 25 to 30 feet of surge, and water just will destroy everything in its path. And it was really sad to see that. So obviously, Katrina, now let's be thankful, didn't make landfall at that point, was 902 millibars, 175 mile per hour winds. It did go through eye wall replacement as it was coming inland, but still at that point, the water was already built up. Yes, the winds weakened, but the water was already, built up at that point. There's nothing you can do to stop it. I've heard this is a good book. I haven't read it, but I've heard people say it's good. My only concern with this type of book maybe is that they focus more on New Orleans than Mississippi. Not taking anything away from New Orleans. I love that city. My grandparents, were engaged and married there. I just got engaged down there. So I love the city. But they were sideswiped. They're on the western side of the storm. That was more of a man-made disaster by not properly building the levees correctly. Mississippi was on the stronger right side with the incredible surge, and it was just wiped off the face of the earth, basically. And it was always not frustrating, that's the wrong word for it, but just disappointing that you didn't hear more about Mississippi because it was literally just gone, all right? And that's something that always has kind of frustrated me a little bit. Obviously, New Orleans was horrible, horrible. And again, not taking anything away from that, but I felt like Mississippi was forgotten a lot on that storm. And if you want to see some amazing before and after pictures, this is a book to check out. Katrina Before and After by the Sun Herald. It's shocking. That's really the best way I can put it. This leads into Ike. Ike was a few years later, and a bad storm. It's actually larger than Katrina. Now, it wasn't as strong as Katrina was, but this was interesting because even though Hurricane Ike was only a Category 2, it was 110 miles an hour, so it was right on the borderline anyway. It produced storm surge not quite to Katrina level, but about 22 feet. It was still really bad. It was the highest storm surge produced by a Category 2. Now, again, it was 1 mile an hour away from a Cat 3. But it just goes to show that don't focus so much on the categories. I heard a lot of people when I was in Galveston, oh, it's a Cat 2, we're fine. Yeah, well, it's a Cat 2, but it's massive and it's going to produce a giant surge. And just to show you the difference in size, look how big Ike was, look how small Charlie was. All right, Category 4, I was in this, most incredible thing I've ever seen, but a small, compact storm. Ike, I was in that as well. I was in Galveston. That just continued and continued and continued and continued. The winds were nowhere near as strong as Charlie. But when you're getting 100-mile-an-hour winds for 3-4 hours straight, it's still going to cause a lot of problems. And, especially with the storm surge, that was the big problem with that. Thankfully for Galveston, I went right over Galveston, so the worst was to the east over Bolivar Peninsula. But some of the pictures I saw out of there looked like damage similar to Katrina. All right, you can see, again, how big Ike really was, a massive hurricane. So here's near Gilchrist, Texas. This is a famous picture you see a lot. This one house is remaining. The bottom is definitely swept out, and you can see some damage to the poles and stuff. But how this house survived, I guess they must have built it stronger. It was like the one house that survived in Michael in Mexico Beach. But you can see the destruction. You can see what the storm surge did. I mean, everything was pretty much leveled. Very similar to Katrina. I mean, I'm not going to say it was as bad as Katrina, but that's some of the worst storm surge damage I've seen. Here's a good book on that. It's called Infinite Monster. It's about Hurricane Ike, so it's a good book if you want to read more about Ike. That leads into the 1900 Galveston storm, all right? So Galveston has a history of hurricanes that goes way back, all right? And obviously the 1900 hurricane changed American history. All right, there's really no way around that. It definitely changed American history. All right. First off, it wasn't well warned, even though there was warning signs. And I have you read a book, hopefully, or I'm not going to force you, but if you'd like to read a book more about it and learn more about this, I think this is one of the more fascinating stories. That and the 35 hurricane to me are kind of neck and neck on more fascinating. But with the 1900 hurricane. You had Isaac Klein, who was the meteorologist in charge, or the meteorologist, the head of the Weather Bureau there, and his brother was there. And again, long stories, but he didn't believe hurricanes could hit Galveston. He had all these misconceptions about Galveston that just were not true. Well, there was warning signs a storm was coming, and Cuba kind of hinted at it as well, even though we ignored it. But his brother, who was also a meteorologist, but as it was younger brother, and obviously him being the older brother, he's kind of stubborn and didn't really want to listen to his younger brother. His younger brother saw the signs. He saw the periods of the waves increasing and the water rising, and he was very concerned about it. It wasn't until the storm hit that Isaac Klein finally realized how big of a mistake he really made. And, it was just completely devastated. The storm surge was bad. This was an intensifying Category 4 hurricane, so a very powerful hurricane. And really, what finally stopped the surge was it was pushing so much of the debris, so much of the houses, people, everything. And as it pushed it up, it kind of made its own levee. That's finally what stopped it from destroying kind of the northern part of the bay part of Galveston that actually made it for the most part. I mean, it's still damaged, but it wasn't devastated by the water because of that levee that was built. Isaac Klein's house was destroyed. A lot of the people in Galveston went to his home thinking that he did. He had one of the stronger homes there. But what happened was a train trestle dislodged, and it kind of rolled, and it just smashed his house. And his pregnant wife passed away, and his 2 kids did survive. His brother actually saved them. And after that, his brother left, and from the best I can tell, they never talked again. So it really affected them. It changed history. Galveston at the time was one of the richest cities in the United States. Its port was a deep port, and they were getting so much shipments of cotton. I think it was like 70% of the cotton coming to the United States was coming through Galveston. Again, one of the richest cities in the United States, one of the larger cities in Texas. I mean, it wasn't the largest, but it wasn't quite Dallas or Houston, but it was still a good-sized city and definitely one of the most prosperous, richest cities. And this changed the history of the United States. The reason why Houston is what it is today is because of this hurricane. Not that Houston wouldn't have grown and become a great big city, but this really accelerated that growth because once Galveston was destroyed, then they started taking the shipping to Houston, and then the money started going more to Houston. And Galveston now is kind of more of a sleepy resort type area, but I enjoy going there. I like traveling there, but nothing like it used to be back in 1900. So here's a memorial on Seawall Boulevard there in Galveston. Here's a trace of the storm. It was intensifying as it came into the Gulf, Category 4. One thing that's interesting here, kind of goes back to the tips, especially, it was weak. Makes me wonder, did that do that jump thing I'm talking about where the center relocated? Because you can see how it kind of turned that hard turn there. I mean, there's no way for me to know that for sure, but kind of just makes me wonder. Maybe it did jump. Maybe instead of doing, instead of doing more like this, it just did the jump and then came in more that way. I don't know. I mean, there's no way to know that for sure, but I thought that was interesting. Here's a map of the damage. Here's Galveston Island. You can see all that debris and everything got pushed up, and it kind of made like a levee. 10,000 people conservatively dead. I've heard accounts as high as 12,000. It's really hard to know exactly, but the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. They did construct the seawall after the storm. It took them 2 years, from 1902 to 1904. They raised the city 17 feet and built a seawall. And that came in big time because in 1915, another powerful Category 4 hurricane came into Galveston. All right. And instead of 10,000 people dead, 11 people died in the 1915 hurricane. All right. So here's the construction of the seawall. It's pretty impressive. Even to this day, I wouldn't say it's 17 feet anymore because the way the sand is built up and stuff. But there's some areas where it's still 10, 12 feet, I would say. And that did protect the island big time, even in Ike. All right. So that seawall is very important. It's on the... If you look at Galveston, it's on the eastern side of Galveston. So the eastern side of Galveston is protected. The western side, not so much. All right. So that 1915 storm came in a similar direction, but it didn't do that little jump thing, or I don't know exactly why it did that, but a little bit different of an angle. But again, 1900, no seawall, 10,000 people dead. 1915, seawall, Ray's Island, 17 feet, 11 people dead. All right, still caused a lot of monetary damage, but you can see that seawall has really protected them. Some good books. This is a hard one to find. This is from 1900 by, I think it's Halstead. He was a journalist of his era, and you can see in this picture here that someone's looting and they're shooting him. This was a journalist perspective of the hurricane and the horrors of, and obviously, I won't get into all the stories, but there's some really disturbing things that happened after this hurricane. All right. Since I want you to read the books, I won't tell you all of them. One I will tell you, they did try to take the bodies and take them out to sea, and when they dumped them out of the sea, they washed back up onto the shore, and they eventually had to cremate them. All right, so there's a lot of really crazy stories from this, and that's actually not even near the worst. All right, Through a Night of Horrors, it's a good one. A Week in September, another good one. But this to me is the greatest weather book ever written. All right, Isaac Storm by Eric Larson. If you're going to read any of them, read this one. All right. I love Storm of the Century by Willie Dyer. That's right up there with this one. But to me, this is the greatest weather book ever written. It really not only tells the story of 1900 Galveston, but it really makes you emotionally invested into the characters. I think History Channel did kind of like a 2-hour little movie on it, I believe, about 15, 20 years ago. So if you were going to read any book, this would be the one that I would read. And you know what? How about this? If you buy this book and you read this book and you do a write-up on this book and you send it to me before the final exam, I'll give you some extra credit towards the final, maybe like 10 points or something like that. It's not going to be anything crazy. I'm not going to give you 50 points on the final. But if you read this book, you do a write-up on it, put some effort into it, then I'll give you up to 10 points on the final exam, and I'll offer that obviously to everyone. All right? You don't have to do that. But if you'd like, that's how much I enjoy this book, and that's how much I think you'll enjoy it. Hey, it's an offer. It's extra credit, so it can only help you. All right. So I hope you enjoyed that. I try to keep it short and sweet. I'm sure I went a little bit longer than I should, but it's hard to kind of condense some of this stuff because, again, I can talk about an hour just on the 35 Labor Day. So again, hopefully this was enjoyable. Definitely get some of those books if you're interested in this. Some of them are really good, especially Isaac Storm, the 35 Labor Day book, and some of the other ones are good as well.